My name is Margaret Halloway and I am 67 years old. And on the Tuesday morning my son cut off every account I had. I was standing at the kitchen sink of the house I had lived in for 41 years washing a single coffee cup. The water was running warm over my hands. The radio was playing something soft, a program about gardening that I only half listen to anymore, because James had already told me twice that the subscription to the public radio pledge drive was unnecessary, and he would be canceling it at the end of the month. I remember that morning very clearly. I remember the way the light came through the window above the sink and caught the edge of the ceramic dish drainer. I remember that I had put on the blue cardigan my husband Harold bought me the last Christmas he was alive, and that I had buttoned it wrong and only noticed when I sat down to drink my coffee. I remember that I was thinking about nothing in particular, which is how most of the worst mornings of a person's life tend to begin. The phone rang at 9:15. It was the bank. A very polite young woman whose name I did not catch the first time and had to ask for twice said she was calling to confirm that I had authorized the closure of my personal checking account and the transfer of the remaining balance to the joint account I shared with my son. She said it the way they train them to say things, with the warm professional voice that makes you feel, for just a second, like everything must be in order because she sounds so sure. I told her I had not authorized any such thing. There was a pause on her end. She said, "Let me pull up the file, Mrs. Halloway, one moment." I could hear her typing. I could hear another phone ringing somewhere in her office. I stood at my kitchen counter with the cup still wet in my hand and watched a small brown bird land on the feeder outside and pick at it and leave again. And in that long, slow minute while the young woman at the bank read through whatever was on her screen, something inside me that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes. She came back on the line. She said, "I am showing the authorization was signed yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Halloway. I am showing your signature and a notary seal, and a power of attorney document that was filed with us last month." She said it more quietly this time. She said, "Is there someone there with you?" I told her there was not. I told her to read me the date on the power of attorney document. She read it. It was from the 3rd of March, which was a Thursday, and I remembered that Thursday because James had come over with a folder of paperwork he said was for the house insurance renewal, and I had signed the top page where he pointed, and he had taken it away before I had finished my tea. I remembered that he had been very cheerful that afternoon. He had brought a small bakery box with 2 almond croissants in it and had made coffee for me himself, which he almost never did, and he had sat on the arm of the couch and not the couch itself, which is something he does when he is in a hurry to leave. I had noticed at the time that he seemed in a hurry. I had not thought anything of it. A mother does not think anything of it when her son brings her croissants. I asked the young woman at the bank if she could tell me what other accounts were affected. She said she would have to transfer me to a different department. She said the word affected very carefully, as if she were trying not to use a worse one. She said, "Mrs. Halloway, I am sorry, I want you to know I am sorry." She said it the way a person says it when they have been trained not to, and I understood from that one small sentence that whatever had happened in a way that even the young woman at the bank, who had never met me, could tell was wrong. I thanked her. I set the cup down in the sink. I sat down at my own kitchen table in my own kitchen, and I did not cry, because I have never been a woman who cries at the first blow. I have always been a woman who waits. The next 40 minutes were the kind of minutes I hope I never have again. I called the bank back through the main line and went through the same conversation with a man this time, who was less kind and more efficient, and who told me in 3 clipped sentences that the checking account was closed, the savings account had been reduced to the minimum balance, and the certificate of deposit I had been rolling over every 6 months since 1987 had been cashed out, and the funds moved to the joint account that James had set up when I was recovering from my hip surgery the previous summer. The joint account I had agreed to because he said it would make it easier for him to pay the bills while I was in the rehab facility. The joint account I had forgotten about because when I came home I went back to using my own account the way I always had, and no one had thought to mention that the joint one was still open and that his name was still on it and that he had apparently been watching it the whole time. I called the credit card company. The card was canceled. I called the second credit card I kept for emergencies. That one was canceled too. I called the utility company, which was something I did out of a kind of rising panic, and the woman there told me in a bright voice that the account had been switched to autopay from the joint account and I should not need to worry about a thing. I did not tell her that the joint account was no longer a joint account, in the sense that anyone would recognize. I did not tell her that I had been, in a single day on paper, Reduced to a woman who owned nothing except the clothes in her closet and the cardigan buttoned wrong across her chest. I hung up the phone. I sat at the table. I looked at my hands, which had done a great many things in 67 years and had never, I realized, been this still. And then I thought about Harold. I thought about Harold because Harold had been dead for 4 years and 3 months, and I still, on certain mornings, turned toward his side of the bed expecting the warm weight of him there. I thought about Harold because Harold had always said, "Maggie, you are the smartest woman in any room you walk into, and you let people forget it because you are also the kindest, and one day that is going to cost you." I thought about Harold because he had said to me about 3 weeks before the stroke took him, "Maggie, listen to me now, if anything ever happens, you go to the study, you open the bottom drawer of my desk, and you look underneath the false bottom I put in there the summer after I retired. You look there and only there. Do you understand me?" And I had laughed at him because Harold had a dramatic streak that came out sometimes when he had been watching too many spy movies, and I had said, "Harold, honestly, a false bottom, what are you, a character in a novel?" And he had taken my hand, and he had not laughed, and he had said, "Maggie, promise me. You look there." And I had promised him because that was what a wife did when her husband looked at her like that. And then 3 weeks later he was gone, and I had not looked because looking felt like accepting that he was not coming back to explain. And so for 4 years and 3 months the bottom drawer of Harold's desk had remained closed, and I had walked past the study door every single day and never once opened it. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about Harold, and I thought, he knew. He knew something. He knew that our son, who was 39 at the time and already showing signs of the particular kind of charm that Harold did not trust, was going to do something like this one day. Harold had known our boy better than I had. Harold had never said so, because Harold was not a man who spoke ill of his children even to his wife, but Harold had known, and Harold had made a plan, and Harold had told me where to look, and I had not looked. I stood up from the table. My knees did what they do now, which is to remind me that they exist. I walked down the hall past the pictures of James as a baby and James as a boy on a bicycle and James on his wedding day with his arm around Rebecca, who was wearing a dress that cost more than our first car, and I walked into the study. The study still smelled like Harold. I do not know how that is possible after 4 years, but it does. It smells like the particular pipe tobacco he kept in a tin even though he had quit smoking when I was pregnant, and it smells like old books, and it smells like the lemon oil he used on the desk every Sunday. I knelt down, which my hip did not enjoy, and I pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. It was empty, which is how he had left it. I ran my hand along the bottom. It felt solid. I pressed harder. I felt at the back right corner a very small indentation, the kind you might miss if you were not looking for it. I pressed it with my fingernail and something clicked and the bottom of the drawer shifted by about ½ an inch. I pulled it up. Inside the false bottom was an envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 things. A letter written in Harold's handwriting, which was cramped and careful and made my chest hurt the second I saw it. A bank card from an institution I had never heard of, a credit union 3 towns over, with my name on it. And a small folded sheet of paper with a 4-digit number and a phone number and 1 sentence written beneath in Harold's hand, which said, "Maggie, call this man first. He is expecting you." I sat down on the floor of the study with my back against the desk and I read the letter. The letter said, "Maggie, my love, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. And I am sorry I was not there to help you handle it." The letter said, "You have always trusted James more than he deserves, and you have always trusted yourself less than you should." The letter said, "When I retired I did something I did not tell you about because I did not want to worry you and because I did not want to be wrong about our son. I moved a portion of our savings into an account in your name only, at a credit union where we do not do any other business, and I have been adding to it every year." The letter said, "There is enough there to keep you for the rest of your life if you are careful, and there is a man named Arthur Delacroix who is the manager of that branch, and he was my friend from the war, and he has been watching the account for me and he is expecting your call." The letter said, "I hope you never need this letter. I hope our boy surprises me. But if he does not, Maggie, do not be ashamed and do not be slow. Call Arthur." And then it said, "I love you more than I ever found the words to say, and I am sorry I am not there to say them now." I read the letter twice. Then I folded it very carefully and I put it back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in the pocket of the cardigan I had buttoned wrong that morning, and I stood up and I went back to the kitchen and I picked up the phone. And I dialed the number Harold had left for me. A man answered on the second ring. He said, "Delacroix." I said, "My name is Margaret Halloway, and my husband told me to call you." There was a silence on the other end that lasted about 3 seconds, And then the man said, in a voice that had gone softer than it had been when he picked up, Mrs. Halloway, I have been waiting for this call for 4 years. I'm so sorry it came. Tell me what is happening. I told him everything. The phone calls, the joint account, the power of attorney, the croissants, and the Thursday afternoon. I told him that I had a son named James and a daughter-in-law named Rebecca, and that I lived alone in the house Harold and I had bought in 1982. I told him that I had a grandson named Caleb who was 11 years old and who was, as of that morning, the only person in my bloodline I was sure had not betrayed me. I told him about the false bottom and the letter and the bank card in my pocket. I talked for 22 minutes. He did not interrupt me once. When I was finished, Arthur Delacroix said, Mrs. Halloway, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am going to tell you 4 things. He told me that the account Harold had set up had a balance that made me have to sit down at the table again, because I had not understood until that moment that my husband had been, in the quiet way he did everything, a far more careful man than I had ever given him credit for. Arthur told me the exact number, and I do not intend to say it here, but it was enough that the phrase rest of your life that Harold had used in the letter was, if anything, an underestimate. He told me that the account had been structured in such a way that James could not have accessed it even if he had known about it, because Harold had set it up as a sole owner account with a specific clause requiring Arthur's personal verification of any activity. He told me that he had, on Harold's instructions, been quietly watching the public records on our primary accounts, and that he had been concerned for several months now about patterns he had seen, and that he had almost called me twice but had held off because Harold had asked him to let me come to him in my own time. And he told me, finally, that he had in his office a small folder of additional paperwork Harold had prepared for me, including copies of the original deed to our house, which was something I had assumed James held, and which I was about to learn was something James had only ever held copies of. The original, Arthur said, was in a safe deposit box at his credit union, and the name on that box was mine and mine alone. I did not say anything for a while. Arthur waited. He was a man who knew how to wait, and I was grateful for it. I said, finally, Mr. Delacroix, what would you like me to do? He said, Mrs. Halloway, call me Arthur. Harold did. And I would like you to come to my office. I would like you to come tomorrow morning if you can. I would like you to bring the letter and the card and any documentation you can find in your house regarding the power of attorney that was apparently signed in March. I would like you to say nothing to your son. I would like you to behave today and tomorrow and for as long as it takes, exactly as you would behave if none of this had happened. Can you do that? I said, yes, Arthur. I can do that. He said, good. And then just before he hung up, he said, Mrs. Halloway, I am going to tell you one more thing. And it is the thing Harold wanted me to tell you if this day ever came. He said, Harold said, Maggie, you are smarter than anyone you have ever allowed in a room with you. You are going to need to remember that now. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the cold cup of coffee I had not finished and at the cardigan I had buttoned wrong, and I unbuttoned it and buttoned it again correctly, one button at a time, and then I went upstairs and I drew a bath and I got into it and I cried finally, not loud and not long but thoroughly, the way a woman cries when she has been handed back the shape of her own life after forgetting what it looked like. When I came downstairs 2 hours later, dressed in a clean blouse and a pair of slacks I had not worn since Harold's funeral because they made me feel like a person who had business to attend to, the phone was ringing. It was James. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment before I picked it up, and in that moment I made the first of what would be many small, precise decisions in the weeks to come. I decided that I would not let him hear a single thing in my voice that was not exactly what he expected to hear. I said, hello, sweetheart. He said, Mom, hi, listen, I just wanted to check in. How is your morning going? He said it the way he had said things since he was 12 and had broken something in the kitchen and was trying to get in front of the conversation before I noticed. He said it in the voice that had, I realized now, never really been trustworthy, and that I had chosen for 39 years to trust because he was my son and I had loved him from before he could speak. I said, oh, it's fine, honey, just puttering around. How are you? He said, good, busy, you know. Listen, Mom, I had a thought I was going to come by this evening. Maybe bring Caleb, have dinner with you. Rebecca's got her book club thing, so it would just be the two of us and the kid. Does that work for you? I said, that would be lovely, James. I will make that chicken thing Caleb likes. He said, great, 7 okay. I said 7 was fine. He said, see you then. He said, love you. He said it very easily. He said it the way a person says love you when they have just finished, that morning, draining their mother's savings account and are checking in to make sure she has not yet noticed. I said love you too, sweetheart. I said it the way I had said it every day of his life. Then I hung up and I walked into the study and I opened the bottom drawer of Harold's desk and I ran my fingers along the false bottom until I heard the small click. And I did not cry this time because there was work to do. At 7 o'clock James arrived with Caleb, who came in first through the kitchen door because the kitchen door is the one the family uses. Caleb was carrying his backpack and wearing the glasses he had recently started needing, and his hair was too long in the front the way 11-year-old boys wear it now. And when he saw me he came straight across the kitchen and hugged me around the middle without saying a word, which was something he had done since he was 3. James came in behind him carrying a bottle of wine I knew he had not paid for with his own money and set it on the counter and said, "It smells good in here, Mom," and smiled at me with the easy open smile of a man who has recently stolen something and is confident he got away with it. I smiled back. I kissed him on the cheek. I said, "Go sit down, I'm almost ready." Dinner was the chicken. It was the chicken I had made for James every Sunday for the first 18 years of his life, and had made for his college roommates when they visited, and had made for Rebecca the first time James brought her home, when she had picked at it with her fork and said, "Oh, this is nice, Mrs. Halloway, what is it?" It was not a complicated dish. Did not need to be. I put it on the table and I poured a glass of the wine James had brought for him and a glass of milk for Caleb, and I took water for myself because I wanted my head clear. And I sat down at my own table in my own kitchen and I watched my son eat my food with the appetite of a man who believes the world is running exactly the way he has set it up to run. He talked through most of the meal. He talked about work, which he always described in the same vague expansive way, as if he were running something more important than he actually was. He talked about Rebecca's book club. He talked about a trip he said he and Rebecca were thinking of taking to somewhere warm in the fall, somewhere you needed a passport for, which he mentioned very casually and which I noted because James had not, until that morning, had the money for the kind of trip he was describing. He talked about Caleb's grades, which were good, and about Caleb's reading, which was also good, and Caleb sat quietly across from me and ate his chicken and every so often looked at me in the way that 11-year-old boys look at adults when they are listening more carefully than anyone realizes. Toward the end of the meal James put down his fork and said, "Mom, listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." He said it the way he said things when he was about to ask me to sign something, which was what I had been waiting for. I set down my own fork. I folded my hands in my lap. I said, "Of course, sweetheart." He said, "So, you remember how we set up that joint account last summer when you were in rehab?" I said I did. He said, "Well, I've been thinking it might be simpler if we just, moved more of the day-to-day stuff through there." He said it would just be easier for bills and things. He said you wouldn't have to worry about any of it. He said, "You've worked hard your whole life, Mom. You shouldn't have to be managing all this at your age." I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the face of my son, which was the face I had watched change from a baby's face to a boy's face to a young man's face to the face of the 39-year-old man sitting across from me now, and I thought, "Oh, James. Oh, my boy. You have no idea that I already know." I said, "That is very thoughtful of you, honey." I said, "Let me think about it." He nodded. He was not expecting resistance and he did not get any, and so he moved on. He always moved on quickly when he was not opposed. He said something about a friend of his at the bank who could help us with the paperwork, and I nodded and I made a small sound of agreement, and Caleb across the table from me looked up from his chicken and his eyes met mine for just a second. And in that second I saw something in my grandson's face that I had not expected to see. He knew something. I do not know how I knew that he knew something. It was the way he was looking at me, which was not the way an 11-year-old looks at his grandmother when everything is normal. It was the way an 11-year-old looks at his grandmother when he has overheard a conversation he was not supposed to hear, and he is trying to decide whether to tell her about it. I had seen that look on my own son's face 30 years ago. The evening before he admitted he had broken the window of the neighbor's garage with a baseball. I knew that look. I did not do anything with it at the table. I did not ask him about it. I smiled at him and I passed him the bread and I said, "Caleb, sweetheart, how is school?" And he said, "It's fine, Grandma," and we moved on. But I filed that look away. I put it in the same place where I had already put the Thursday afternoon with the croissants and the bright voice of the woman from the utility company, and the quiet 3-second pause on Arthur Delacroix's end of the phone. I was building, without quite realizing I was building it, a kind of record. Decades of teaching Sunday school had trained me to notice what children did not say. Decades of marriage to a quiet man had trained me to notice what people did not do. I had been, without knowing it, a very well-prepared woman my entire life, and all that preparation was coming due. After dinner, James stood up and stretched and said, "Mom, that was great. Really, thank you." And he said, "Listen, Caleb, go get your stuff. We should head home." And Caleb nodded and went upstairs to the guest room where his backpack was. In the moment when Caleb was out of the room and James was rinsing his plate in the sink, which he did exactly once a visit because he wanted credit for it, he said, "Oh, Mom, I almost forgot." He said, "I was thinking I might swing by tomorrow and pick up a few things from Dad's study." He said, "There's some old paperwork in there I was going to go through. Just stuff that's probably outdated, don't worry about it." He said it in the easy voice, the voice of a man asking for nothing. My heart went very still in my chest. I did not show him my face. I dried the glass I was drying and I said, "Of course, honey, whenever you want." I said, "There's a lot in there, I should probably clean it out one of these days." He said, "Exactly, Mom." He said, "I'll just take care of it for you." He said, "It's one less thing for you to think about." Caleb came back downstairs with his backpack. James hugged me at the door. He hugged me the way he had hugged me since he was a teenager, which was with one arm and a slight distance, like he was trying not to get anything on his shirt. He said, "Love you, Mom." He said, "I'll be by tomorrow around 11, okay?" I said, "I'll be here." I said, "Love you, sweetheart." I closed the door behind them. I stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the empty table. Then I walked into the study and I opened every drawer of Harold's desk and I carried everything that was in them, every envelope and every file and every loose paper, upstairs to my bedroom and I piled it on the bed. Then I went back into the study and I found the photograph of Harold that had sat on his desk since the year before he retired, the one of him standing in front of the hardware store he had managed for 31 years with his hand on the shoulder of a younger employee he had mentored. And I took it off the desk and I carried it upstairs too, and I set it on my nightstand next to the lamp and I said out loud to Harold, "I am listening now, my love. I am sorry it took me this long. I am listening now." Then I went downstairs and I called Arthur Delacroix at home, because he had given me his home number, and I told him that my son was coming to the house at 11 in the morning to take certain papers out of the study, and that I would very much like to be at Arthur's office before 9. Arthur said, "I will have coffee waiting." I barely slept that night. I lay in bed with Harold's picture beside me and I went through, in my mind, every interaction I had had with James in the last year. And I began to see it all differently, the way you see a painting differently when someone tells you what the painter was actually trying to say. The hip surgery. The joint account he had set up while I was sedated. The way he had taken over the mail for a month while I was in rehab. And the way certain statements had begun arriving to his address instead of mine when I came home. And I had thought nothing of it because James said the post office had made a mix-up. The afternoon with the croissants. The insurance renewal I had signed without reading because my son, my James, had pointed at the page and smiled at me. Rebecca's new car last fall. The trip they had taken to Napa for their anniversary, which James had told me his bonus had covered, though I had not known at the time that James had not actually received a bonus that year, because I had not known anything about his finances at all, because I had been for 4 years the widow of a quiet man, and I had been letting the life he had left me drift along like a boat no one was steering. At 3 in the morning I got up and went downstairs and made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about Caleb. I thought about the look he had given me over the chicken. I thought, that child knows something and I am going to have to decide very carefully what to do about that. Because I was not going to put an 11-year-old in the middle of what was about to happen. But I was also not going to let him carry something alone. If he had heard what I thought he might have heard, there would be a right moment and I would wait for it. At 5:30 I got dressed. I put on the good slacks again and a blouse Harold had always said made my eyes look less tired. And I made myself eat a piece of toast even though I was not hungry. And at 7:40 I got into my car and I drove the 42 miles to the town where Arthur Delacroix's credit union sat on the corner of what turned out to be a very quiet street with 2 flower planters in front of it, and a sign in the window that said member owned since 1961. I parked. I took the envelope out of my bag. I walked up the 3 steps to the front door. Arthur was waiting for me in the lobby. He was a tall man, older than me by maybe 5 or 6 years, with white hair cut short and the straight-backed way of standing that told me everything I needed to know about the part of his life Harold had shared with him before I ever met Harold. He shook my hand. He said, "Mrs. Halloway, it is an honor." He said, "Please come back with me." His office was small and very tidy. There was a second cup of coffee waiting on the desk beside his. There was a folder on the desk that was thicker than I expected. He sat me down. He did not make small talk. He said, "Mrs. Halloway, before we begin, I want you to understand one thing." He said, "Your husband was not a suspicious man." He said, "Your husband loved your son. But your husband was also a man who had seen what money does to people, and he had seen it in his own brother, who I believe you knew, and he had made up his mind very quietly a long time ago, that he would protect you whether or not he lived long enough to do it himself." He said, "What we are about to go through is not a punishment for your son. It is a protection for you. I want you to hold on to that difference. It will matter in the weeks to come." I nodded. I said, "Thank you, Arthur." I said, "I am ready." He opened the folder. And for the next 2 hours he walked me through what my husband, over the course of the last 15 years of his life, had quietly built for me. The account, of course. The deed to the house in a safe deposit box with my name on it, which meant that whatever James believed he had in his drawer at home was a copy, and a copy only. A second life insurance policy I had not known existed, paid up in full, with me as the sole beneficiary. A small set of investments in Harold's name that had transferred to me at his death and that had, because neither of us had known about them, not been touched in 4 years and had, therefore, grown. A letter of instruction Harold had left with Arthur, detailing which attorney I should call and which accountant I should call and in what order, and a second letter sealed, which Arthur handed to me unopened and said, "This one is just for you, for when you have time." I sat in Arthur's office with my hands flat on his desk and I understood, slowly and then all at once, that my husband had not left me a widow. He had left me a woman with a life he had been preparing for me from a distance, and that all I had had to do to claim it was open a drawer. I said, "Arthur," I said, "what do I do about my son?" He said, "That is not a question for me." He said, "But I will tell you this." He said, "Your husband did not set this up to hurt James. Your husband set it up because he knew that one day you might need to stand on your own 2 feet in front of your own son and not need anything from him. He said, what you do with that is yours to decide." I sat for a moment. Then I said, "Arthur, I would like to open a new account with you today, a personal checking account in my own name, and I would like to have funds transferred into it from the main account in an amount that will cover my living expenses for 1 year. And I would like a new debit card which I will use starting today for everything. And I would like you to help me find an attorney quickly, because my son is about to discover that the power of attorney document he had me sign in March is not going to get him what he thought it would." Arthur smiled for the first time since I had walked into his office. It was a small, brief smile, and there was something in it that I recognized from the photograph of Harold in his study, something from a life I had not been a part of, a life the two of them had shared before I knew either of them. He said, "Mrs. Halloway, I have been hoping you would say something like that." He made the calls. He was very efficient. By 10:45 I had a new checking account, a new debit card in my purse with my name on it in shining silver letters, an appointment at 1 o'clock with an attorney named Miriam Chun who had represented Arthur's credit union for 15 years and who, Arthur told me with obvious affection, did not lose cases, and a small legal pad on which I had written in my own handwriting, the 3 things I was going to do when I got home. The first was to put Harold's letter back in the false bottom drawer, exactly where he had left it, because I had a feeling, from the way James had talked the night before about clearing out the study, that James was going to look in that drawer today. The second was to make sure James did not see one single thing different in my face or my house or my behavior. And the third was to sit down that evening and begin writing down in careful order every small moment of the last year that, in the light of what I now knew, told a different story than the one I had been telling myself. I drove home. I got there at 10:40, which was 20 minutes before James was due, which was exactly the margin I had wanted. I put the envelope back in the bottom of the drawer. I did not put the letter back, because I had taken the letter with me that morning and left it in Arthur's safe, which was the one change I allowed myself. In the envelope where the letter had been I put a blank sheet of paper folded the same way, the same size, the same weight. If my son opened the false bottom of his father's desk today, which I had decided he would find an envelope with a blank sheet of paper inside it, and he would put it back, and he would not know that anything had been there at all. At 10:58 the doorbell rang. I opened the door. James was standing there with a cardboard box under his arm, the kind of box you get from a moving store, and he was smiling the easy open smile, and he said, "Hi Mom, you look nice, are you going somewhere?" I said, "No, sweetheart, I just felt like dressing up today." He said, "Good for you." He said, "Okay, if I just head back to the study." I said, "Of course, honey, do you want coffee?" He said, "No thanks, I've got some," gesturing to a paper cup he had brought with him. He walked past me down the hall. I went into the kitchen. I sat at the table. I listened. I heard the drawers opening. I heard him pull out the bottom drawer of Harold's desk. I heard a pause. I heard the click of the false bottom. There was a silence which lasted about 7 seconds, and then I heard him set something down on the desk, and I heard another silence, and then I heard the sound of the false bottom being pressed back into place, and the drawer being closed. I heard him, a moment later, rummaging through a different drawer. He was looking, I understood, for what he had expected to find and had not found. He was looking for the letter Harold had warned him about. He had known somehow that Harold had left something, and it was not there. And because it was not there, he would, I knew, assume that it had never been there, and that Harold's warning, if there had even been a warning, had amounted to nothing. James came out of the study about 20 minutes later carrying the cardboard box, which had a few old file folders in it and what looked like one of Harold's old leather address books. He kissed me on the top of my head and said, "Thanks, Mom, this is great. I'll let you know if I need anything else from in there." He said, "Oh, and Mom, about the account thing we talked about." He said, "Maybe we can sit down next week and just go through the paperwork, nothing big, just get it squared away." I said, "Of course, sweetheart." He said, "Love you." He went out the front door. And I watched through the kitchen window as he put the box in the back seat of his car, and got in and drove away down the street. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after he was gone. I stood there until my hip reminded me to sit down. And then I sat at the table and I picked up the phone and I called Miriam Chen's office to confirm my 1 o'clock appointment, and I sat in my own kitchen in my own house and I thought about how Harold, my Harold, had known our son better than I had, and had loved me more than I had understood, and had waited 4 years and 3 months for me to be ready to open a drawer. At 1 o'clock I sat in the office of a woman I had never met before, and I told her, from the beginning, everything. She listened. She took notes. She asked me 3 questions, all of them sharp. She told me, at the end, that the power of attorney James had filed was going to be revoked within 48 hours, that the transfers out of my accounts were likely recoverable in full, that the joint account could be closed down within the week, and that the question of whether or not to pursue criminal charges against my son for forgery, fraud, and elder financial abuse was a question she wanted me to sit with for at least a few days before I answered, because once the paperwork started, it would be very hard to stop. I said, "Miriam," I said, "may I ask you something?" She said, "Of course." I said, "In your experience, when a son does this to his mother, is he usually in trouble that we don't yet understand?" She set down her pen. She looked at me. She said, "Mrs. Halloway, in my experience, yes, he almost always is." I said, "Thank you." I said, "I would like to know what the trouble is before I decide anything." She said, "I will find out for you." She said, "Give me a week." I said, "Take whatever time you need." I drove home. The sun was slanting low across the road by the time I pulled into my driveway. I got out of the car. I stood for a moment looking at the house. It was the house Harold and I had bought in 1982 with a down payment we had saved for 6 years, and it was the house where James had taken his first steps, and it was the house where Harold had died, and it was the house that, as of that morning, I had been told was still mine, deed and all, because my husband had been a man who thought ahead. I walked up the front steps. I went inside. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened my purse and I took out the debit card Arthur had given me, and I looked at my own name printed in silver on the plastic and I thought, "All right, Harold." I said it out loud to nobody in my own kitchen. "All right, my love. I am listening now." The week that followed was the strangest week of my life, and it was strange for reasons I could not have predicted. It was not strange because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. James did not call in a panic. Rebecca did not appear on my doorstep. The bank did not phone me with news. The house did not feel any different when I walked through it. I made my tea in the morning and I walked to the mailbox and I watered the hydrangeas that Harold had planted the second summer we lived in the house, and I sat in the evenings with a book I was not really reading, and from the outside anyone looking in would have said, "There is Margaret Halloway, living the quiet life of a widow, exactly as she always has. The strangeness was entirely inside me. The strangeness was that I was, for the first time in 41 years, lying to my son every time I spoke to him, and I was finding to my own surprise that I was good at it. He called on Wednesday evening, 2 days after he had come to the house for the box of papers. He called the way he always called, which was at around 8 o'clock after dinner at his house, when Rebecca was usually in the other room and Caleb was supposed to be doing his homework. He said, "Hi Mom, just checking in." He said, "How was your day?" I said, "Oh fine, sweetheart, I had lunch with Dorothy from church. We went to the little place on Elm." I had not had lunch with Dorothy from church. I had not left the house. I had spent the afternoon on the phone with Miriam Chan and then with a forensic accountant Miriam had recommended, a man named Bertrand who had a voice like a tired professor, and who had asked me for a list of every account I had ever had and every transaction I could remember that had seemed unusual in the last 2 years. James said, "That's nice, Mom. How is Dorothy?" I said, "Oh, she's well. Her daughter is moving to Portland." James said, "Huh, that's far." He did not ask anything else about Dorothy, because he did not care about Dorothy, and because he had never bothered to learn in 39 years, the names of any of my friends well enough to keep them straight. I had known this about him for a long time, but I had always told myself it was because he was busy. Now, sitting at my kitchen table telling him a lie about a lunch that had not happened, I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room that you had always assumed was warm. He said, "Mom, listen, I wanted to ask you something." I said, "Of course, honey." He said, "So I was going through the stuff I took from Dad's study, and there's this old address book of his, and I was wondering if you had any idea who some of these people were." He said, "There's a name in there I can't place." He said it very casually. He said, "A man named Arthur Delacroix." I did not hesitate. I had been preparing in a loose way for this exact question because Arthur had warned me on the phone Tuesday morning that James might look at that address book, and that Harold had kept it for 40 years and had written many names in it, and that there was no way to know which ones might catch James's eye. Arthur had said if he asks, tell him the truth about the part that is easy. Tell him Arthur was a friend of his father's from the war. Do not volunteer anything else. So I said, "Oh, Arthur, yes, he was a friend of your father's. They served together. I have not thought about him in years." I said, "Your father used to send him a Christmas card." I said, "Is he still alive?" I put a small note of polite curiosity in my voice, the way a widow would, when asked about one of her late husband's half-forgotten acquaintances. James said, "I don't know, the address looks old." He said, "I just wondered." He said, "There are a few numbers in here I might call just to let people know about Dad, in case they never heard." He said it as if this was a kindness he was considering. He said it as if he was a man who called strangers to inform them of deaths that had happened 4 years ago out of the goodness of his heart. I understood in that moment that James was already beginning to worry that something was not quite in order, and that he was starting, in the quiet way he always did these things, to sniff around the edges of whatever he could not yet see. I said, "Oh, that's sweet of you, honey." I said, "Your father would appreciate that." I said, "Let me know who you reach." I said it the way a mother says things when she is perfectly innocent and has nothing to hide, and James said, "Will do, Mom," and we talked for another 4 minutes about nothing and we hung up, and I sat at the kitchen table with my hand still on the phone and I thought, he is going to call Arthur. He is going to call Arthur and he is going to find out that Arthur is alive. And he is going to try to find out why his father kept in touch with a man 3 towns over at a credit union none of us had ever heard of. I called Arthur the next morning. I told him. Arthur said, "Mrs. Halloway, he already called." I said, "Oh." Arthur said, "Yesterday afternoon, actually." He said a young man named James Halloway had reached the main line and asked to speak to him and had introduced himself as Harold's son and had said he was going through his father's papers and wondered if Arthur remembered Harold. Arthur said he had been perfectly cordial. He said he had told James that yes, he had known his father during the war, and that they had lost touch many years ago, and that he was sorry for the family's loss. He said James had asked if Harold had had any business with the credit union in recent years, and Arthur had laughed and said, "Oh goodness, no, I doubt your father even knew I worked at a credit union. We only exchanged Christmas cards for a while." Arthur said he had been, in his words, a very boring phone call for your son to have had. He said James had thanked him and hung up and that had been the end of it. I said, "Arthur." I said, "You are a good liar." He said, "Mrs. Halloway, I spent 2 years in military intelligence." He said, "Lying is the oldest skill I have." He said, "Now listen, I have something to tell you." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Miriam called me this morning. She said she has begun to find what she was looking for. She said, you are going to want to come in on Monday. She said, bring a friend if you can. She said, what she has to show you is not going to be easy. I sat at the kitchen table after that call and I did not move for a long time. Outside the window the brown bird was back at the feeder. The sun was coming in at the morning angle. The clock in the hall was ticking. And I sat there and I understood, without Miriam having told me yet, that my son was in trouble far deeper than I had realized, and that I was about to learn what kind, and that whatever she showed me on Monday was going to change the shape of the decisions I was going to have to make. I called Dorothy from church. I told her what had happened. I told her all of it because Dorothy had been my friend since our boys were in Cub Scouts together, and Dorothy had buried 2 husbands and 1 sister and had a kind of clear-eyed steadiness that I had always admired and had not realized, until that phone call, that I was going to need. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When I was finished she said, Maggie, she said, I am coming over. She said, I am bringing a casserole because it is what I do, but I am mostly coming to sit with you. She said, do not argue. I did not argue. Dorothy was at my door in 40 minutes. She came in, she put the casserole in the refrigerator. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything, and then she sat down at the kitchen table across from me and she said, all right, tell me what you need. I said, Dorothy, I need you to come with me to Miriam Chin's office on Monday. She said, done. She said, what else? I said, I need you not to tell a single other person at church or anywhere else until I say so. She said, Maggie, I have kept worse secrets than this one. She said, what else? I said, I need to talk to Caleb. She paused at that. She said, your grandson. I said, my grandson. I said, he knows something, Dorothy. I can tell. He knows something and I do not want him carrying it alone, and I do not want to ask him to tell me, because I am not going to put that child in the middle of a fight with his father. But I need to let him know that if he ever wants to tell me anything, I am here, and I will not be angry, and I will not repeat what he says to anyone. Dorothy said, Maggie, that is the right thing. She said, but you have to be careful how you do it, because an 11-year-old boy who is carrying a grown man's secret is already scared. And if you push you will only scare him more. I said, I know. I said, I was thinking of asking him for a sleepover this weekend. I said, we used to do those when he was little. He loved them. James and Rebecca always took the weekend when he came. I said, I will just ask the way I would have asked 3 months ago. I will see if he still wants to come. Dorothy said, good. She said, and when he is here, Maggie, you are not going to ask him a single question about his father. She said, you are going to bake him cookies and let him watch a movie and let him stay up too late and let him know in every small way you know how that this is a house where he is safe. She said, if he has something to say, he will say it. And if he does not say it this weekend, he will say it the next time or the time after that. She said, you have spent 39 years earning the kind of trust that matters to that child. Use it gently. I called Rebecca that afternoon. I called Rebecca because Caleb's sleepovers at my house had, for the last 2 years or so, required Rebecca's permission, which was something I had let happen without ever thinking about it, and which I now understood had been, like a great many other small things, part of the slow tightening of the space around me. I said, Rebecca, hi dear, I was thinking it would be nice to have Caleb over this weekend if you and James didn't have plans. I tried to keep my voice light. Rebecca said, oh Margaret, that's sweet. Let me check with James. I think we were thinking of going to the lake. She said it in the slightly bored tone she reserved for conversations with me, the tone that communicated that my request was being processed by a department of her life that was not a priority. She said, I'll call you back. I said, thank you, sweetheart. She did not call back. James called back an hour later. He said, Mom, Rebecca said you wanted Caleb for the weekend. He said, you know, that's a great idea. Actually, we were going up to the lake with the Morrisons. It will be easier without him. I did not flinch at the phrasing. I had, in the last 5 days, become very good at not flinching. I said, wonderful, I will pick him up Friday after school. James said, actually, Mom, why don't I drop him off? You shouldn't be driving at rush hour. He said it the way he said all the small controlling things wrapped in what sounded like concern. I said, that is very thoughtful, honey. I said, Friday at 5. He said, Friday at 5, great, love you, Mom, and he hung up. Friday at 5, James pulled into the driveway and Caleb got out of the car with his backpack and the small blue duffel bag he had used for sleepovers since he was 7. James did not get out. He waved at me through the windshield and backed out of the driveway, and Caleb came up the front walk by himself and I opened the front door for him and he walked in and set down his bag and instead of hugging me around the middle the way he usually did, He stood very still in my front hall and looked at me and said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I closed the door. I said, "Of course, sweetheart." He said, "Is Daddy in trouble?" I did not answer right away. I had made myself a promise that I was not going to lie to my grandson, and I had also made myself a promise that I was not going to tell him anything that would frighten him, or that would put him in a position where he had to carry the weight of grown-up things. Standing in my own front hall with this 11-year-old boy looking up at me through his slightly smudged glasses, I felt those two promises sit against each other, and I understood that I was going to have to find a middle path through them, very carefully starting right now. I said, "Caleb, come sit down with me at the kitchen table." I said, "I have cookies in the oven." I have not started cookies in the oven. I had not thought of cookies, but I said it anyway because it gave us both something to do with our hands. I walked into the kitchen and he followed me and I got out the mixing bowl and the butter and I said, "Caleb, I will answer your question, but first I want to tell you something." I said, "Grown-ups sometimes get into trouble. It is not a nice thing, but it is a true thing." I said, "When a grown-up gets into trouble, the people who love them sometimes have to make hard choices, and those choices are not fun for anyone." I said, "But none of that is your job." I said, "Your job, Caleb, is to be 11. Your job is to do your reading and draw your pictures and come to my house when your parents are at the lake, and not to worry about any of the grown-up things." I said it looking at him across the counter, and he watched me the way he always watched me when I was telling him something important, which was with his full attention, which is a thing 11-year-olds can do when you take them seriously. I said, "So here is what I am going to tell you." I said, "I do not know yet whether your father is in what a grown-up would call trouble." I said, "There are some things I am working on with some grown-ups, and when they are done I will know more." I said, "Caleb, you asked me a question, and I am not going to lie to you, so I am going to say this." I said, "I am worried about your father, yes." I said, "But I am also making sure that whatever happens I will be okay. And your father will be okay. And your mother will be okay. And you," she said, and I looked at him very directly now, "and you will be okay whatever happens." I said, "I am your grandmother, and that is not going to change no matter what happens with anyone else." He stood there for a moment. Then his face did the thing it had been trying not to do for at least a week, which was to fold, and he started to cry quietly, the way an 11-year-old cries when he has been keeping something inside for too long. I came around the counter and I pulled him against me and I held him, and he cried into my shoulder and I let him, and I did not say anything because I had learned from raising James and watching Harold with him when he was small, that when a child finally cries you do not fill the crying with words. You just let the crying happen. After a while he pulled back and wiped his face and said, "Grandma, I heard Daddy on the phone." I did not ask him any follow-up. I did not push. I said, "Okay, honey." He said, "I heard him say that Grandpa had hidden something from him, and that he had to figure out where it was before anyone noticed the money was gone." He said, "I wasn't supposed to be listening. I was in the hall. I was going to ask him something about a book, and I heard him say it and I just stopped." He said other stuff too, Grandma. He said he was worried you would find out, and that if you did find out he would have to handle it. He said the word handle the way a child says a word he has heard but does not fully understand. He said, "Grandma, what does he mean, handle it?" I knelt down in front of my grandson, which my hip objected to, and I put both of my hands on his shoulders, and I said, "Caleb, listen to me very carefully." I said, "Your father loves you. Your father is going to love you no matter what happens in the next few weeks, and I am going to love you no matter what happens in the next few weeks, and your mother is going to love you, and none of this is about you." I said, "What your father meant when he said he would handle it, is that he would try to talk me out of worrying. He said it is a grown-up word that means to manage. It does not mean to hurt. I do not believe your father would ever hurt me, and I want you to not believe that either." I said it because I needed him to be able to sleep that night, and because in spite of everything I had discovered about my son, I did not, in that particular way, believe he would. Not the kind of hurt an 11-year-old imagines when he hears a word like handle. James was many things I was only now admitting to myself, but he was not that. I said, "Caleb, thank you for telling me." I said, "I am going to ask you one favor." I said, "I am not going to tell your father that you told me because that is between you and me." I said, "And I am going to ask you not to tell your father that you told me either because that is also between you and me." I said, "That is not me asking you to lie. That is me asking you to let a grown-up handle a grown-up thing." I said, "If your father asks you anything, you can tell him we made cookies and watched a movie and I told you about the time Grandpa built the back fence. Can you do that?" He nodded. He said, "Yes, Grandma." I said, "Good." I said, now come on, we are going to make these cookies before I give up and buy them from the store. We made cookies. We watched a movie that was too old for him and that he pretended to follow the plot of, and that he fell asleep during with his head against my arm. I sat on the couch for another hour after he was asleep, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the word handle, and thinking about how an 11-year-old in the hallway of his own house had heard his father say it, and had understood it as a threat, and had been carrying that fear for a week while eating his breakfast and going to school and handing in his book reports. I thought about how many mothers in the world right now were failing to see the small signs in their own grandchildren, and I thought about how close I had come to being one of them. I carried him to the guest room the way I had when he was 4. He was heavier now. It was not easy, but I got him there. On Monday morning, Dorothy drove me to Miriam Chen's office and she came in with me and she sat in the waiting area reading a magazine while I went into the conference room where Miriam was already waiting with Bertrand the forensic accountant and a large stack of printed papers and, to my mild surprise, Arthur Delacroix. Arthur stood up when I came in. He said, Mrs. Halloway, I asked if I might be here because some of what Miriam is going to show you intersects with the accounts at my credit union, and I thought it would be easier if I could answer questions directly. I said, thank you, Arthur. I said, I am glad you are here. Miriam waited until I was sitting down. She had a folder open in front of her. She said, Mrs. Halloway, before I begin, I want to tell you 3 things. She said, the first is that everything we are about to discuss is recoverable. She said, the second is that your son is going to face consequences for what he has done, but you will have some say in how severe those consequences are. And the third is that what I am about to show you is worse than what we thought on Tuesday, and I am sorry for that. She said, are you ready? I said, I have been ready since Tuesday, Miriam. She said, all right. She opened the folder. She began to walk me through what Bertrand had found. She showed me first the power of attorney document James had filed. It was not the document I had signed. I had signed a single page on my kitchen table, the page he had said was for the house insurance. The document that had been filed at the bank was 9 pages long, and my signature appeared only on the 9th page, exactly where James had pointed, but the other 8 pages were pages I had never seen. They contained language that gave James broad authority over all of my financial accounts, the ability to make decisions regarding the sale of property, and the ability to redirect any federal benefits I received, which in my case meant my Social Security and the pension from Harold's company. Miriam said, this is not a legitimate power of attorney. She said, this is forgery. She said, the notary seal on the document appears to belong to a notary who, when we contacted her, had no memory of notarizing any such document for your son. She said that notary's stamp had, apparently, been duplicated. She said, what that means, Mrs. Halloway, is that your son did not merely take advantage of your trust. He constructed a document with fraudulent intent. She said, that is a felony. She said it calmly. She showed me next the bank records Bertrand had assembled. She showed me the movements from my accounts into the joint account, and then from the joint account into 3 other accounts I had never heard of, all of which were in James's name or in the name of a small consulting business he had, apparently, set up 4 years ago without telling me. The consulting business did not appear to do any actual consulting. It was, Miriam said, what is called a shell. It had been used, over the course of the last 2.5 years, to move money through in ways that were beginning to look, under Bertrand's careful review, like more than one kind of trouble. Miriam said, your son has been having financial difficulties for longer than you realized. He has been, at the same time, spending money in ways that would make sense only if he were going to, at some point, inherit a great deal of it very suddenly. She said, the spending has accelerated in the last year. She said, the trip to Napa, the car your daughter-in-law drives, the tuition they are paying for Caleb's private school, which I understand they recently enrolled him in, they are all being paid from funds that, in my professional opinion, were moved from your accounts through the joint account to the shell and back into the household. She said, the paper trail is very clear. Bertrand is very good. She said, Mrs. Halloway, there is one more thing. She said, your son has been, for the last 6 months, in what is called a private arrangement with 2 individuals who lent him a substantial sum of money at an interest rate that is not legal in this state. She said, he is, in the language of this situation, into them. She said, the arrangement has recently begun to call for repayment. That is, she said, we believe why the activity on your accounts accelerated last month. She said, your son was not stealing from you because he thought it would be pleasant. She said, your son was stealing from you because he had run out of options, and he had convinced himself that you would not notice in time, and that by the time you did notice he would have replaced what he took, and no one would ever have to know. She said, Mrs. Halloway, I have seen this pattern before. It almost never ends the way the person who started it thought it would. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I looked at the stack of paper on the table. I looked at Miriam. I looked at Bertrand, who had the decency, through the whole conversation, to not look at me. I looked at Arthur, who was watching me with a kind of careful steadiness I recognized from the photograph of Harold at the hardware store. The look of a man who had seen difficult things before, and who was not going to let them panic him. I said, Miriam. I said, what happens to my son if I press charges? She said, that depends on a number of factors, but the most likely outcome, given the pattern of fraud and the forgery and the movement of funds, is a conviction for elder financial abuse. She said, it is a felony. She said, in this state for amounts like these we are looking at 3 to 7 years. She said, there are other charges that could be added. She said, I do not recommend predicting what a prosecutor will decide to pursue. I said, and if I do not press charges? She said, then we revoke the power of attorney, we close the joint account, we recover every dollar we can from the accounts he moved funds through, we notify the institutions involved of the fraudulent document, and we make sure that your son understands in writing through me, that if he attempts anything of this kind again, ever, against you or anyone else in your family, we will go forward with everything we have. She said, we will also have a conversation, Mrs. Halloway, about the private lenders he owes money to, because those individuals are not going to disappear just because you do not press charges, and you are going to want to think carefully about how that part of your son's life is handled. She said, I have a colleague who handles that kind of thing. She said, not everything that needs doing through a courtroom. I said, Miriam. I said, I need to think. She said, of course. She said, you have time. I said, I have one more question. I said, does Rebecca know? Miriam said, from what we have been able to determine, yes. She said, Bertrand can explain the specifics, but the short version is that Rebecca's signature appears on 3 of the documents setting up the shell business, and funds from the shell have been spent in ways that only a spouse who was aware of the arrangement would have spent them. She said she knew. She said, we cannot prove in every case that she knew every detail, but she knew enough. I sat for a long moment. I thought about Rebecca and her book club. I thought about the passport trip to somewhere warm. I thought about the tuition for Caleb's private school, which I had, now that Miriam mentioned it, never actually asked them about because James had mentioned the school casually last summer and I had assumed, because I always assume things in James's favor, that they had figured it out. I thought about the way Rebecca had spoken to me on the phone on Tuesday with that bored tone, and I thought she knew. She knew the whole time. She knew on Tuesday when she told me she would check with James. She knew when she let Caleb come stay with me, because she needed the weekend free. She had been the entire time watching me from inside her own comfortable life, which she had built on top of the slow, quiet disassembly of mine. I said, thank you, Miriam. I said, I will give you my decision by the end of the week. I said, in the meantime, please revoke the power of attorney, close the joint account, and begin the recovery of the funds. I said quietly, please. I do not want James to know yet. I want to be the one to tell him. Miriam said, of course, Mrs. Halloway. She said, one more thing. She said, when you do tell him, I would like you to do it in my office. She said, you do not owe him that conversation at your kitchen table. She said, and I would like to be there. I said, all right. I said, I will think about the timing. She said, there is no rush. She said, the slower we go, the more complete the recovery. She said, the longer he does not know, the more we can do. I left her office. Dorothy was waiting in the lobby. She stood up when she saw me. She did not ask me a single question. She just took my arm and walked me out to the car, and she drove me home, and when we got to my house she came in with me and she made me tea and she sat at the kitchen table with me and we did not talk for almost an hour. Finally she said, Maggie. She said, are you all right? I said, Dorothy. I said, my son has been stealing from me for 2.5 years to pay for a life I was not invited to. I said, my daughter-in-law has known the whole time. I said, the only person in my family who has shown me anything like loyalty in the last year is an 11-year-old boy who stood in a hallway and listened. Dorothy said, that sounds about right. She said, I am sorry, Maggie. I said, do not be sorry. I said, I have been sorry enough for both of us for 4 years. I said, I am done being sorry. She said, good. That night I sat in the study in Harold's chair, which still had the slight dip in the seat where he had always sat, and I turned on the lamp and I wrote 2 letters by hand. The first letter was to Caleb. I did not plan to give it to him anytime soon. I wrote it because Harold had taught me by example that a letter written and kept was sometimes the only way to know what you actually thought. I wrote to Caleb what I wanted him to know if, one day, he needed to know it, and I sealed it in an envelope and I put it in the false bottom drawer where Harold's letter to me had been, because I had begun to understand that this drawer was going to become, in the years I had left, a place where women in my family stored the truths they wanted their children and grandchildren to have, if the children and grandchildren ever needed them. The second letter was to James. I did not plan to give this one to him either, at least not right away, but I wrote it the same way by hand slowly, thinking as I went. I told him in the letter what I now knew. I told him what I had done about it. I told him what Miriam had found and what Arthur had done and what Bertrand had assembled. I told him that I had not yet decided whether to press charges and that my decision was going to depend in large part on him. I told him that I had one condition, non-negotiable, regardless of whatever else I decided. I told him that I wanted Caleb protected. I told him that if Caleb was ever made to suffer for what his father had done, through the small cruelties and silences that I had learned, the hard way to recognize in our family, I would pursue everything Miriam had offered to pursue and more. I told him that the boy had already heard more than he should have, and that I was not going to watch my grandson pay for his father's sins the way I had, for 41 years, been paying for my own silence. I told him all of this and I signed it and I folded it and I put it in an envelope and I put that envelope in the drawer with the letter for Caleb and I closed the drawer and I sat in Harold's chair in the lamplight for a while longer and I did not cry because I had done my crying already that week, and because the time for crying was behind me now and the time for moving was ahead. On Wednesday morning James called. He called at 10:30, which was not his usual time. His voice was tight. He said, "Mom." He said, "Hi." He said, "Listen, I just got a strange call from the bank." He said, "They are telling me the joint account has been closed." He said, "And they are telling me there is some issue with a document I filed with them last month." He said, "Mom, did you say anything to anyone?" He said it the way a boy says things when he is starting to suspect that the ground he is standing on is not what he thought it was, and when he is even so assuming that his mother will tell him the truth because she always has. I said, "James, honey, what are you talking about?" I said it in exactly the same voice I had used to tell him, on Wednesday the week before, that I had had lunch with Dorothy from church at the little place on Elm. I said it in the voice of a woman who had nothing to hide. I said it, and I listened to my own voice saying it, and I realized that I had become in 11 days, a different woman than the one who had stood at her kitchen sink with a coffee cup and a wrongly buttoned cardigan. I had become a woman who could lie to her son for the right reasons, and could do it cleanly, and could, when the time came, stop lying and tell the truth all at once, in a room he was not going to walk out of the same man. James said, "Mom." He said, "I don't know." He said, "Some confusion at the bank, I am sure." He said, "I will sort it out." He said, "You have not signed anything for anyone else, have you?" He said it so lightly that anyone who was not me would not have noticed the tension under it. I said, "James." I said, "Sweetheart, I do not know what you are talking about." I said, "You know I would not sign anything without telling you." I said, "Your father always said you were the one I should call if I did not understand something." I said it, and I felt for just a second Harold standing behind me with his hand on the back of my chair the way he used to when I was sitting at the desk, and I understood that my husband, wherever he was listening. James said, "Right?" He said, "Right, Mom, of course." He said, "I will figure it out and call you back." I said, "All right, honey." I said, "Love you." He said, "Love you, Mom." He said it fast this time. He said it the way a person says it when he is already thinking about the next phone call he needs to make. He hung up. I set the phone down. I stood in the kitchen. I looked at the brown bird at the feeder. I said out loud to the empty house the way Harold used to talk to himself when he was thinking, "It has started." I said it again. "It has started." I said, "All right, my love." I said, "Here we go." The call from Miriam came on Thursday afternoon. She said, "Mrs. Halloway, your son has been to 3 banks this morning and to the county clerk's office, and he has begun to understand that something is wrong." She said, "He has not yet understood the full shape of it." She said, "But he will, by tomorrow morning at the latest, when his attempt to access the second savings account fails the way the first one did. And when the title search he is paying for at the clerk's office comes back with your name on it alone." She said, "I think we should plan the conversation for Monday." She said, "That gives us the weekend to make sure everything is locked down, and it gives you 3 days to decide how you want to say what you are going to say." She said, "You do not have to decide now whether you are pressing charges." She said, "You only have to decide what you want to walk out of my office having said to him." I said, "Miriam." I said, "Can I bring Dorothy?" She said, "You can bring whoever you want, Mrs. Halloway, this is your meeting." I said, "Thank you." I said, "I will be there at 9. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I walked into the study and I opened Harold's bottom drawer, and I opened the false bottom and I took out the letter I had written to James and I read it again. I did not change anything. I put it back in the envelope and I put the envelope in my purse, and I set the purse on the kitchen counter where I would not forget it on Monday morning. On Friday afternoon James came to the house. He had not called. I heard his car in the driveway and I saw him through the window, and he was not carrying anything, which was unusual, because he almost always brought something, a coffee cup at least, the small stage props of a man who had come by casually and was not building toward a conversation he did not want to have. He came up the front walk with his hands in his pockets. He rang the doorbell, which he also did not usually do because he had a key. I opened the door. I said, "James, honey, come in." He came in. He stood in the front hall. He did not take off his coat. He said, "Mom." He said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Of course, sweetheart, come sit down." I said it as if I had no idea what was coming. I walked ahead of him into the kitchen and I put the kettle on because when I do not know what else to do with my hands I put a kettle on, and he sat down at the kitchen table in the chair he had been sitting in when he told me about the joint account idea on the evening of the chicken dinner, and I sat down across from him and I waited. He said, "Mom," he said, "there is something going on at the bank, and I cannot figure it out, and I was hoping you could help me." He said it the way he had said things as a child when he had broken something and wanted to present the broken thing to me as a mystery we were going to solve together, so that by the time he got to the part where he admitted it was his fault I would have already decided, without quite realizing it, that we were on the same team. I had fallen for this move of his many times in 40 years. I had fallen for it the afternoon he came over with the croissants. I was not going to fall for it now. I said, "James," I said, "what is going on at the bank?" He said, "Well," he said, "it looks like the joint account we set up is closed, and the savings account has some kind of hold on it, and I went to the clerk's office today and there is some," he said, paused, "confusion about the deed." He said, "Confusion." He said it the way he had always said certain words when he was lying, which was as if he was trying out the word to see if I would accept it. He said, "I think someone has been doing something with your accounts, Mom." He said, "And I want to help you figure out who." I sat very still. I looked at my son across my own kitchen table. I looked at the face that had been my face's mirror for 40 years, the slight lift at the corner of the mouth that he had inherited from me, the set of the jaw that he had inherited from Harold, the eyes that were his own. I thought, "You are so much worse at this than you believe you are." I thought, "You have been telling yourself a story about how clever you are for years, and the story was never true, and you are not going to be able to tell it in this kitchen." I said, "James." I said, "Honey." I said, "I know." He said, "What?" He said it quickly. He said it the way a person says what when he has perfectly well heard what was said. I said, "I know about the accounts." I said, "I know about the power of attorney you filed, which was not the document I signed." I said, "I know about the joint account and the shell business and the money you moved through it." I said, "I know about the private lenders, James." I said, "I know about all of it." He went very still. His hands were on the table. I watched them. They did not move for what felt like a full minute. His face did a series of small things in a short amount of time, which was the thing faces do when they are trying to decide which expression is going to save them, and finally they settled on a particular expression I had not seen on my son since he was about 19, which was the expression of a boy who has just realized that he has been caught and who has not yet decided whether to fight or to fall to pieces. He said, "Mom." He said, "It is not what it looks like." I said, "James." I said, "Please do not." He said, "Mom." He said, "Listen." I said, "James." I said, "I have been listening to you for 39 years. I said, for the first time in a long time I am going to talk and you are going to listen and you are not going to interrupt and you are going to hear what I am telling you and then you are going to leave my house and we are going to meet on Monday morning at 9 o'clock at the office of a woman named Miriam Chen, and we are going to have the rest of this conversation there." I said it evenly. I said it without raising my voice. I said it the way Harold used to say the few things Harold said when he had decided finally that he was going to say them. James opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He said, "Mom, please." He said, "Please let me explain." I said, "James." I said, "No." I said, "Here's what I want to tell you." I said, "Your father knew." I said, your father knew the way your father always knew things, which was quietly and without making anyone feel small about it. I said, your father set something up for me a long time ago, that you did not know about and could not have touched. I said, your father left me a letter. I said, your father left me with enough to live on and with a man to call and a lawyer to hire and a plan to follow. I said, James, I did not find any of it for 4 years because I trusted you, and I did not go looking because I did not want to believe I needed to go looking. I said, your father knew me better than I knew myself. I said, he knew I would wait. He said so in his letter in so many words. I said, and what I want you to understand, James, before anything else happens, is that the reason you are going to lose what you are about to lose is not because your mother finally got angry. I said, it is because your father 4 years ago decided that I was not going to be left defenseless. I said, it is because he loved me. I said, it is because he loved you too enough to know what you might one day do and to build around it. I watched James's face while I said this. I watched it go through the stages that faces go through when people who have been lying to themselves for a long time hear the truth spoken calmly by someone who has no interest in hurting them. His face started angry, and then it got younger, and then it got something I had not seen on it in many years, which was ashamed. Not the performance of shame, the thing itself. I recognized it because I had seen it on his face when he was 8 years old and he had taken $1 out of my purse at the grocery store and had at home confessed to it with his whole face before his mouth caught up. He said, Mom. He said, I did not. He stopped. He said, it got away from me. I said, James. I said, I know. I said, Miriam has shown me the paperwork. I said, I understand how it got away from you. I said, I understand about the private lenders. I said, I understand that you have been drowning for longer than I realized, and I understand that you convinced yourself you could replace it before anyone noticed. I said, I have raised you since before you could speak. I said, I know how your mind works when you are frightened. I said, what I do not yet understand, James, is how you could sit at this table 3 weeks ago and bring me croissants and smile at me and slide a document under my hand and lie to me about what it was. I said, and I do not yet understand how Rebecca could sign the paper she signed, and know what she knew, and speak to me the way she has been speaking to me for a year. I said, and I do not yet understand, James, how you could in your own house, within hearing of your own son, say what you said about handling me if I found out. His face changed when I said the last part. I had known it would. I had kept it for last because I had wanted to see it change. He said, what? He said, who? He said, how do you? He did not finish any of the 3 sentences. I said, James. I said, your son is 11 years old and he has ears and he stands in hallways and he loves his grandmother and he heard you. I said, he heard enough of it that he has been afraid for me for a week, and has been afraid for himself for a week, and he asked me on Friday evening in my front hall whether his father was in trouble. I said, that was the question my grandson asked me when he arrived at my house. I said, and I did not tell him anything he did not need to know. I said, but I want you to sit with that, James. I want you to sit, for as long as it takes, with the picture of your son standing in your hallway with his hand on the wall, listening to his father plan how to handle his grandmother. I said, I want that picture to be the one you think about when you decide what you are going to do with the rest of your life. He put his head in his hands. He did not cry. James has never cried in front of me, not as an adult. He put his head in his hands and he sat there for a long time and his shoulders went up and down in a way that was not crying but was very close to it, and I did not reach across the table to him because I was not ready to, and because the old reflex to comfort him at any cost was the exact reflex that had put me where I was, and I had promised myself, sitting in Harold's chair on Monday night, that I was going to retire that reflex for a while and see what happened when I did. After a while he looked up. His face was wet at the edges, not from crying, just from what a face does when a person is trying very hard not to cry. He said, Mom. He said, what is going to happen on Monday? I said, on Monday Miriam is going to explain to you in detail what she has documented. I said, she is going to present you with a set of options. I said, I have not yet decided which of those options I am going to choose. I said, that decision is going to depend on you, James, and on what you say in that meeting, and on what you say afterward, and on what you do for the next year, and on whether I come to believe, which I do not yet believe, that any part of you is still someone I can recognize as my child. I said, I am not going to tell you today what I am hoping you will say on Monday. I said, if I tell you what I am hoping for, you will say it because you are practiced at saying what I want to hear, and it will not mean anything. I said, I want you to sit with this alone for 3 days, and I want you to come into Miriam's office on Monday morning and tell me the truth about what you have done and what you want to do about it. I said, that is going to be the beginning of how I decide. He nodded. He said, Mom. He said, does Rebecca? I said, Miriam is going to handle Rebecca. I said, I am not meeting with Rebecca. I said, that is not my meeting. I said, you can tell your wife whatever you choose to tell her between now and Monday, but understand that anything you tell her Miriam will know because Miriam has eyes in more places than you realize, and because you are not in a position anymore to manage information the way you are used to managing it. He nodded again. He stood up. He said, Mom. He said, I am so sorry. I did not answer. I did not answer because I was not going to lie to him, and because telling him it was all right would have been the lie, and because it was not all right and it was not going to be all right for a long time, and the most loving thing I could do for my son in that moment was to not lie to him about that. I walked him to the front door. At the door he turned and he looked at me, and for just a second he was 8 years old again, standing on the kitchen linoleum with $1 in his hand, and then the second passed and he was 39 again and his whole adult life was hanging from his shoulders like a coat that was finally getting heavy, and he said, Mom, I love you, and he said it the way he had not said it in many years, which was without any performance in it at all. I said, James. I said, I know you do. I said, I have never once doubted that. I said, that is part of why this is so hard. I closed the door behind him. I stood in the front hall for a long time. Then I walked back to the kitchen and I sat down at the table where we had just had that conversation, and I finally let myself cry properly for about 10 minutes and then I stopped and I washed my face at the kitchen sink and I called Dorothy and I said, it is done, and she said, I am coming over, and she did, and she did not ask me a single question, and she sat on the couch with me until it got dark. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock I walked into Miriam Chen's office with Dorothy on one side of me and my purse on the other, and James was already there, sitting in one of the chairs at the conference table, and Rebecca was not with him, which I noted but did not comment on. He looked up when I came in. He looked older than he had on Friday. He had not shaved, which was not like him. He stood when I came in, which was the old training Harold had given him when he was small, and which I had not seen him bother to do for me in many years. I sat down across from him. Dorothy sat in a chair against the wall. Miriam came in. She closed the door. She sat at the head of the table. She had the folder with her. She said, Good morning. She said, James, I am going to begin by telling you what we have documented, and then I am going to tell you what your mother has decided, and then we are going to talk about what happens next. She said, Do you have any questions before we start? James said no. He said, I want to hear it. Miriam walked him through it. She did it the way she had done it for me 2 weeks before, with the same steadiness, with the same careful paper-by-paper presentation, except that now James was on the receiving end of it, and I watched his face the entire time, and I watched him understand piece by piece the precise scale of what he had done and the precise completeness with which it had been caught. He did not interrupt her. He did not defend himself. He looked at each document as she showed it to him. Once, when she reached the forensic accountant's summary of the shell business, he closed his eyes for a moment. Once, when she reached the page about the private lenders, he put his hand flat on the table as if he were steadying himself on it. That was all. When Miriam was finished, she said, James, your mother has asked me to tell you what she has decided. She said she is not pressing charges. James's whole body loosened by about an inch. I watched it happen. Miriam said, James, I want you to understand that this is not mercy in the sense that you are used to hearing the word. She said, this is a conditional decision, and the conditions are extensive, and if you violate any one of them, your mother retains the right to pursue every charge we have documented, and the statute of limitations on every one of them is longer than you are hoping it is. She said, Do you understand me? James said yes. Miriam said, the conditions are as follows. She read them from a page in her folder. She said, First, you will sign today a full confession of what you have done, which will remain sealed in my office, and which will be released to the district attorney immediately upon any violation of these terms. Second, you will pay back every dollar that has been documented as moved from your mother's accounts, with interest at the legal rate, on a schedule that we will agree to today, and which will be automatically drafted from your account, and which you will meet for the rest of your life or until the debt is settled, whichever comes first. Third, you will sell the shell business today, and its assets will be liquidated and applied toward the repayment. Fourth, you will, within 30 days, enter a financial counseling program that I will designate, and you will attend every session, and you will provide me with written proof of attendance. 5th, you will not, under any circumstances and for any reason, contact your mother's attorneys, bankers, or financial advisors without going through me. 6th, you will have no access to any of your mother's accounts, documents, or property in any form for the rest of her life. 7th, and this one, James, is not mine, this one is hers. She looked at me. She said, do you want to tell him this one? I said, I will tell him. I said, James. I said, the 7th condition is about Caleb. I said, you are going to be a better father to that boy than you have been to this point. I said, I am not going to tell you how to do that. I said, that is for you to figure out. I said, but I am going to tell you what I will be watching for. I said, I will be watching for whether my grandson continues to come to my house on the weekends, and whether he continues to talk to me on the phone, and whether he continues to come home from your house looking like a boy who feels safe there. I said, I will be watching whether you tell him, in your own words and in your own time, that what he overheard in your hallway was wrong, and that he was not wrong to have been frightened by it, and that he is not going to hear anything like it again. I said, I am not going to dictate to you how to repair what you broke with your own son, but I am going to know whether you are repairing it. I said, and if I come to believe that Caleb is being punished, in the small quiet ways that I have now finally learned to recognize, for what you did and for what I did about it, then James, I am going to do more than press charges. I said, I am going to petition for partial custody of that boy, and Miriam has already told me I would be likely to succeed. I said, I do not want to do that. I said, that child needs his father, who is capable, I still believe, of being a good one. I said, but I am telling you now, on the record in this room, that Caleb is the line. I said, if you cross that line, I will cross every line I have been standing behind, and I will not hesitate. James was crying by the time I finished. He was crying the way he had not cried in front of me since he was a boy. He was not trying to hide it. He put his face in his hands and he cried into them, and he did not say anything, and I did not reach for him. Miriam waited. Dorothy waited. I waited. After a while he took his hands away from his face and he said, I accept. He said, I accept all of it. I said, James. I said, do not say it like that. I said, this is not a thing you are accepting because you have no choice. I said, this is a thing you are going to have to choose every day for the rest of your life. I said, the first day you stop choosing it, you will lose everything you have left. I said, I want you to understand the difference. He nodded. He said, I understand. He said, I will choose it. Miriam passed him a pen. The meeting ended at 11:15. James signed what he had to sign. He was quiet the whole time. When it was over, Miriam said, James, I will be in touch with you by tomorrow afternoon with the schedule for the counseling program. She said, do not contact your mother until I tell you it is time. She said, do you understand? He said, yes. He stood up. He looked at me. He said, Mom. He said, thank you. I said, James. I said, do not thank me today. I said, thank me in 5 years if we both get there. He nodded. He walked out. Dorothy drove me home. We did not talk much on the drive. When we got to the house, she said, do you want me to stay? I said, no, Dorothy. I said, I think I need to be in my own house by myself for a while. She said, I will call you tonight. She said, if you do not pick up, I will come over anyway. I said, I know you will. I said, thank you, Dorothy. She hugged me. She left. I walked into my house. I took off my coat. I walked into the study. I sat in Harold's chair. I looked at the photograph of him I had moved upstairs and then moved back down because the study had felt wrong without it. I said out loud to the room, it is done, my love. I said, I did what you set up for me to do. I said, I hope I did it the way you would have wanted. I did not hear Harold answer because I am not a woman who hears voices, and Harold, in all the years I knew him, was not a man who raised his. But I felt, sitting in his chair, the particular settled warmth I had felt a few times since he died, which was the feeling that Harold had heard me, and was satisfied. In the year that followed, a great many small things happened and not many big ones. That is how life mostly unfolds after the big thing has happened. James paid back what Miriam had set the schedule for on time every month. He sold the shell business. He went to the counseling program and he sent Miriam the attendance forms, and then he went to a second program Miriam had not required, and then to a therapist of his own choosing whom he still sees. He did not become a different man overnight because people do not become different men overnight, but he became a man who was watching himself carefully, which was not something I had ever seen him do before. I spoke with him on the phone about once every 2 weeks for the first 6 months. The calls were short and a little formal. Gradually they got longer. Gradually he began to ask me how I was, and to listen to the answer. Rebecca left him about 9 months after the meeting in Miriam's office. I was not surprised. I felt for her in a distant way because I understood that whatever she had signed and whatever she had known, she had not been the author of the whole arrangement, only a beneficiary of it, and the collapse of that arrangement had left her with a life she had not planned for. She did not speak to me during the separation, and she has not spoken to me since, and I have made my peace with that. Caleb lives primarily with James now, which I would not have predicted a year ago, and which I am told by the family counselor the two of them have been seeing is working. Caleb spends every other weekend at my house. He is 12 now. He is still too thin. His hair is still too long in the front. He still hugs me around the middle when he comes through the kitchen door, and he has started in the last few months to tell me things about school on his own without my asking, which I take as the best sign I have had in a long time. I gave him the letter I had written him on the night after Miriam's first revelation. I gave it to him on his 12th birthday. I told him it was for him to read someday when he was older or to not read if he did not want to. I told him that either way it was his. He held it and he looked at it and he said, "Grandma, can I read it when I am 16? I said, "Caleb, you can read it whenever you decide." He put it in the drawer of the nightstand in the guest room at my house, and every time he comes to stay, he checks that it is still there. I know this because I have checked the drawer once after he has gone home, and the letter has been moved by small amounts each time, as if he has taken it out and looked at the envelope and put it back. I saw Arthur Delacroix again, not long after the meeting with James. He retired last spring. He called me when he did. He said, "Mrs. Halloway, I wanted you to know personally because your account was the last one I was still personally watching, and I wanted to tell you that I am handing it over to someone I trust." He said, "I also wanted to tell you that in 43 years of banking, I have never once seen a plan work the way Harold's worked." He said, "I am sorry it took as long as it did for you to find it." I said, "Arthur, it took exactly as long as it needed to take." I said, "I am not sure I would have been ready any sooner." He said, "Harold would have said the same thing." He said, "He always said you had your own timing, and that you knew it better than anyone." He said, "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Halloway." I said, "Arthur, thank you." I said, "For everything." He said, "You are welcome." He said, "And Mrs. Halloway." He said, "I am going to tell you one last thing that your husband once told me." He said, "Harold said Maggie will be all right because Maggie has always been all right, she just needs one person now and then to remind her of it." He said, "I am glad I got to be that person." I said, "Arthur." I said, "You were." I said, "Thank you, my friend." I said it the way Harold would have said it. Arthur was quiet for a moment. He said, "Goodbye, Mrs. Halloway." I said, "Goodbye, Arthur." And we hung up. I live now the same life I lived before, but I live it differently. I live in the same house. I have not moved, and I do not intend to. I have the same neighbors and the same hydrangeas, and the same kitchen window with the same brown bird at the feeder, which I have come to suspect is not the same bird at all but a succession of brown birds that I have, out of some stubborn hope, decided to think of as one. I make my tea in the mornings. I read in the afternoons. I have lunch with Dorothy once a week, and this time I actually have it at the little place on Elm, where the owner now knows my order and brings it without my having to ask. I have taken up, of all things, a pottery class at the community center because Harold, when he was alive, once told me I had good hands for it, and I had always thought, oh well, someday, and it occurred to me about 6 months after the meeting in Miriam's office, that someday was a word I had been using to postpone my own life for 40 years, and that I was going to stop using it. My pots are not very good. I do not care. The woman who teaches the class is 28 years old and thinks I am charming, which I find amusing because in my experience nobody who is actually charming has ever been called it, and I was not charming at 28 and I am not charming at 67, but I am perhaps finally at ease and people confuse the two. I sit sometimes in the evenings in Harold's chair in the study with the lamp on and I think about what happened. I think about the Tuesday morning and the wrongly buttoned cardigan, and the phone call from the bank. I think about the false bottom of the drawer. I think about the Thursday afternoon with the croissants, and about the chicken dinner, and about Caleb standing in my front hall asking me if his father was in trouble. I think about Arthur on the other end of the phone saying he had been waiting 4 years for that call. I think about Miriam laying out the pages. I think about James at my kitchen table putting his head in his hands. I think about all of it and I turn it over and I try to find the lesson in it, because Harold used to say that the only thing worse than a hard experience was a hard experience you did not learn anything from. The lesson I have decided is not the obvious one. The obvious one is about trust and about watching the people you love, and about not signing papers without reading them, and those lessons are all true, but they are not the deep one. The deep one, the one I sit with in the evenings, is about silence. I had been silent for 40 years. I had been silent about things I saw in my son, and about things I felt in my own marriage, not because Harold and I had a bad marriage, we did not, but because even in a good marriage there are things a woman notices and does not say, and they accumulate. I had been silent about things I noticed in my daughter-in-law. I had been silent about the way my grandson sometimes arrived at my house looking thinner than he had the month before. I had been silent because I had believed, for most of my life, that keeping the peace was the same as making peace, and they are not the same, and they were never the same, and Harold knew it, and that was why Harold, in his quiet way, had built a plan around the silence he knew would never break on its own. He had given me in that bottom drawer not just a bank card and a letter. He had given me permission. He had given me the one thing I had not been able to give myself, which was the understanding that I was allowed to stop being quiet. I think about this, and I think about the women who watch this story unfold and who recognize pieces of themselves in it, and I want to say to them, from the chair in the study where my husband used to sit, this: you already know. Whatever it is in your own life, you already know. You have been knowing for longer than you have been willing to admit. Your hands know it when you wash dishes. Your shoulders know it when you walk into certain rooms. The space between your ribs knows it when a certain person's name comes up on your phone. You do not need to be rescued, and you do not need to wait for a letter in a drawer, though if you have one, open it. What you need, what I needed, what most of us need, is one clean, honest minute with ourselves in our own kitchens, in which we stop explaining away what we already know, and we sit with it and we let it be true. Everything after that minute is easier than the minute itself. I am not a woman who had her life taken from her. I am not a woman who was rescued by her dead husband's foresight, though his foresight helped. I am a woman who was given very late in life a chance to find out what she would do if she finally stopped being quiet, and what I did was I picked up the phone and I called a man named Arthur Delacroix and I told him the truth, and then I kept telling the truth to every person I met after that, to Miriam and to Dorothy and to Caleb and eventually to James, and telling the truth turned out to be, after 40 years of not telling it, the single most freeing thing I have ever done. My son is not the man I hoped he would be. He may in time become closer to that man. He may not. I have stopped this past year making the shape of my own life depend on the answer to that question. I love him. I will always love him. I do not owe him the shape of my life, and he does not owe me the shape of his, and the air between us is easier now that we both know that. Caleb comes over this Saturday. He is going to help me plant bulbs in the flower bed Harold put in the first summer we lived in the house. He asked if he could on the phone last week. He said, "Grandma, are you going to put in the tulips again this year?" I said I was thinking about it. Why? He said, because I want to help. He said, Dad said he would drive me over. I said, that would be lovely, sweetheart. I said, come in the morning, we will have pancakes first. He said, okay, Grandma. He said, I love you. I said, I love you too, Caleb. I said it the way I used to say it to him when he was small, which is the way I say it to him now, because nothing that has happened in the last 2 years has changed the way I feel about that child, and nothing is ever going to. I stood at the kitchen window last night after I got off the phone with him, and the sun was going down behind the neighbor's fence, and the brown bird was at the feeder, and I could hear, faintly, the ticking of the clock in the hall, and I said, out loud, to nobody, to Harold, to myself, to the version of me who had stood at this same window 2 years ago with a coffee cup and a wrongly buttoned cardigan and no idea what was coming, I said, we are all right, my love. I said it the way Arthur had said it about me. I said it and I believed it, and I walked away from the window and I turned off the kitchen light and I went upstairs to bed in the house that was mine, and I slept through the night, which is a thing I had not done in a very long time, and which I have ever since that evening been able to do most nights, which is more I have come to understand than most people get in this life, and which is I have decided enough.